Ask Chuck.
All right. First question comes from Gary of Newburyport, Massachusetts. Are defense and security experts concerned about the Trump administration's push to have European countries increase their defense budgets? For the past 80 years, having the U.S. serve as the continent's de facto security force seemed to be a key factor in the prolonged peace the region has seen. Given their centuries-long history of conflict, when there is no backstop and tariff-related changes in global trade connections and alliances, should the world be nervous about a more heavily armed Europe? Well, Gary, I feel like, are you asking a question or are you really making a statement? Because, yes, I think we know. Every, I, I say this mostly tongue in cheek, but a little bit nervous. I mean, the last time Germany was able to rearm, how did that go for Europe? Right? We're now going to put France is thinking about spreading its nuclear weapons all over the continent. Maybe that's not a bad idea. The more you have them in different countries, maybe that does sort of potentially keep an uneasy peace, right? Sort of the MAD mantra, mutual assured destruction. But look, this is this is what bothers me about sort of. So on one hand, Trump wants to be the preeminent power of the world. Well, we are the preeminent power of the world. And one of the reasons we are is because we are the security defense for Europe. Hard stop. We are that umbrella. We basically are in charge of securing two continents, North America, and arguably that means we basically are going to protect South America, although that hasn't fully been premise hasn't been tested, and Europe, right? So 2.5 continents we're providing security for. That's nobody else is that's a super duper power. So we want to give that up, right? There's always been a movement on the right, the sort of the isolationist wing of the party, clearly where JD Vance comes from. Trump basically has stumbled into that part of it. I don't think he's naturally thinks this way. I think he is just at the end of the day transactional and binary. So he ends up in that category. I think Vance is more of a true believer in the sort of isolationism, if you will, or sort of let everybody manage their own affairs and let's see what happens. The fact is that it hasn't worked for the globe, right? That is not a way to keep peace. That is not a way to keep security. So look, I'm not sure it's a good move. I think it makes America less secure, and I think it makes the world less secure. Pure and simple. All right. Matt W. writes, you are 100% correct about doubling the size of the House, but it will remain gridlocked if that's all we change. Our first past the post elections give us the two parties and the resulting incentives to resist compromise. In your episode with Rob Sand, he advocated for approval voting in open primaries. I like that idea, but I prefer ranked approval voting. The candidate with the highest approval score moves on, wins. I'm not a fan of what traditionally gets called ranked choice voting, i.e. automatic runoff voting. It's barely any better than first past the post. What is your preferred voting method that would break the two parties into 4+ competitive parties with the incentive to compromise in Washington? Would you consider advocating for that system as vociferously as for open primaries and for doubling the size of the House? Love the show. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Look, I have not thought hard enough about first past the post ideas. I will say this. Here's what I want. Okay. Ranked choice voting just isn't going to get the trust of the public. It could work. And in theory, I basically would like to do it, but the hard way, which is I think the top 4 should move to a general election. And then you pick from there. And if nobody gets 50, the top 2 meet again in a runoff. That's what I think. Right now, if you can decide as a party whether, we could have, I'd love to see open primaries completely, top 4 advance to the general without, 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever it is. And then the top 2, if nobody gets 50, would meet in a runoff. I think that gives everybody a voice. I think that would open things up. I don't want to dismiss first past the post ideas. It might be a better way, if we do double the size of the House, maybe some states will want to go to there's some thought that you could, let's say you're a state that has 8 congressional districts. So for instance, and I'll give you an example of this. Miami-Dade County used to elect all school board members were elected countywide. and I think they had, let's say there were 9 members of the school board. The top 9 advanced, and was the school board. There's some people that think, hey, maybe you hold your congressional elections. So if you're a state that has 8 congressional districts, everybody runs statewide, everybody votes statewide, and the top 8 get, because this is the thinking there is, if you get the top 8, and if you would get sort of pooled voting, right? Maybe some group would vote on identity politics and surface up one type of candidate. Maybe some group would practice ideological politics and surface another type of candidate. But that, if you had top 8, you'd get a congressional delegation that truly was representative of the entire state. Now, the problem with that is, what if all 8, let's say you're talking the state of Iowa, and you get 8, but all 8 are from Des Moines, right? And you don't have anybody from Cedar Rapids or Dubuque or Sioux City. You get my point, right? So, but it's one of those ideas that I don't dismiss, say, in a county for state representative races, right? Or for state Senate races, if you have a large enough state Senate or state House. So I think there are circumstances where that might be an interesting idea. But ultimately, when it comes to statewide elections and sort of larger elections, I think we ought to have top 4 in a general, and it opens it up to other primaries, to other political parties. The duopoly is what is stifling innovation in American politics. That is just a fact. The duopoly stifles it. If these were private organizations, I think there'd be a case that the FTC, that they could break up this duopoly, but this isn't how it works. Since guess who runs the FTC? The duopoly, right? There's never been a duopoly that's never been more embedded in government than the GOP and the Democratic Party. I I think we've got to come up with infrastructure, voting infrastructure that that incentivizes non-major party candidates, that allows people who are independent, that allows people who have a different points of view to feel as if their voice can be heard in a reasonable way. So I'm really glad you picked up on the Rob Sand point about first past the post and the approval ideas. Look, all of these things I think will be coming to various states over the next 20 or 30 years. I think we're going into a period. It's one of these things. I can't wait for 50 years from now for political scientists to talk about the 50 years that we're about to experience, because I think we're going to have a lot of reform experiments. Some will work, some won't. Just like what happened arguably in the first 50 years of the 20th century. Some of them stuck, right? Direct election of senators, giving women the right to vote. Some didn't. Prohibition. So I do think we all agree that the system as it stands doesn't work. And I think, thanks to the 50 states, we should start seeing some interesting experiments beginning sooner rather than later. Ranked choice voting being one of them that we're already seeing play out, and we're kicking the tires on it. And this was something I was a huge advocate of. Now I'm like you, Matt. I'm a little less into it than I was before. All right. Last question. Dr. Walter S. Will the cognitive Biden litmus test become the Democratic version of the 2020 election or January 6th? Or will this remain a non-healing wound until it is acknowledged and apologized for? Lastly, if you were Buttigieg or another prominent Democrat, how would you answer the Biden cognitive question? Boy, this I don't know if we know the answer just yet. There's a fine line here. I go back to Carter and Dukakis, right, in Mondale. They were, when you lose, you're usually sort of ostracized in one form or another. I'm trying to remember. I think, I certainly think Mondale in '84 acknowledged Carter. I think Carter was at his convention. I'm not sure if he spoke at that convention. Certainly was not a part of the Clinton '92 convention, right, or any of that. I think it's possible that the Democrat that wins the nomination is the one with the least amount of Biden ties. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean no Biden cabinet secretaries, or a Biden cabinet secretary makes it through because the other candidates had closer ties to Biden? I do think it's going to be In the same way the Bush brand was just forever tainted by WMD and the not finding the WMD. And I think ultimately it's why Jeb Bush's candidacy couldn't get off the ground, is that the Bush baggage still was too heavy to carry into a campaign in 2016. And the fact that Donald Trump not only didn't get penalized for going after the Bushes, he seemed to get rewarded inside the party for having the guts to go after the Bushes. So it is, I suspect it will be somewhat of a litmus test. Um, to me, if I were Buttigieg, I would just tell the truth, right? Which was, look, um, I didn't have a lot of interaction. I always had some question about this, but I felt confident in Joe Biden because of what I was watching with Donald Trump. Um, I don't try to come up with something else. I think that's the likely answer. And if that's the answer, you just lean into it and own it. Um, you know, I know that I'm not going to conduct my presidency that way, something like that. Um, and I'm going to be for, mandating more medical records to do this or that. I think you can deal with it. Um, and if anybody can talk their way out of this one, out of this, it's Pete Buttigieg, right? I don't know if others can as much. Pete is better at this than most, right? He has the gift of gab. Um, but it's got to be believable. And like I said, I've had these conversations with various folks over the last few years on this issue. It was Donald Trump's presence that created an illusion of reassurance. It was frankly, Democrats had their own version of Trump derangement syndrome. And in Trump derangement syndrome, right, which the right likes to call every critic every once in a while. But in this case, what I think one of the symptoms is you just assume everybody sees the worst version of Trump that you're seeing. And most voters, not a lot of voters see that same version, right? Some of it has to do with the bubble you live in and this or that. And I do think this was a version of people in the White House had Trump derangement syndrome. No way the January 6th guy is going to be able to beat even a half awake Joe Biden. So it was all done under the cover of comforting themselves by the perceived weaknesses that they thought Donald Trump was bringing to this campaign. And they were weaknesses. They just weren't weaker than the biggest weakness that either candidate had, which poll after poll after poll showed was age and capacity to serve a full second term. Um, I will tell you this. Pete's going to learn a lot. If Kamala Harris runs for governor, how it'll be interesting to see if how forgiving California voters are of her, how she answers the question of what did she see? When did she first start becoming concerned? Does she lean into it or not? And does avoiding it create a problem for her that, oh, she's not coming across authentic or honest or whatever it is. So if you have some Biden baggage and you're thinking about running for president in 28, um, watching how Kamala Harris navigates this and seeing how voters, particularly Democratic voters in California, receive this will provide, I think, some guidelines for how those with some Biden baggage in 28 decide to deal with it.